Hello from Bloomington. I'm Heidi Kessner, Dean of the Kelley School of Business. I want to thank you for participating in this important roundtable discussion. Wherever you are in the world, the pandemic has been and continues to be challenging on many levels. Many are experiencing stress and heartache from losing family and friends. In addition, the pandemic has disrupted our everyday lives and livelihoods on a global scale. And of course, there are ample uncertainties going forward. I think we can all agree we still have very challenging paths to navigate, paths that require short-term and long-term solutions. As we look forward to recovery, it's imperative that we share ideas, insights, and best practices so we can lift each other up and press ahead on solid footing. We'll have to be nimble as well, opening ourselves up to new ideas and visions wherever they may take us. The pandemic has certainly shown us just how interconnected we are. We are truly all in this together, and we will recover together. I urge you to keep the conversation going long after this roundtable program ends. Thank you again for participating, and please stay healthy and safe.
Welcome to the Indiana University Kelley School of Business's Worldwide Roundtable Discussion. My name is Levon Schlegel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for International Business, or IIB as we are more casually known. I would like to thank Dean Kessner for kicking off our second set of roundtables in our 10th anniversary celebration programming. And thank you all for joining us as we begin the fourth of our 5 global panels. During these 2 days, we have had distinguished speakers in Sub-Saharan Africa, Mexico and Latin America, the Middle East, North Africa, China, and the US, all gathering to tackle a topic that is on everyone's mind, the economic recovery post-pandemic. You are among the almost 800 total registrants to these 5 events. And as you can imagine, it takes a global team to put this together. I would like to thank Jen Goyens and Allison DeWitt from the Kelley School Alumni Association, Roy Hooper from the IU Alumni Association, Ali Batten, Director of the IU Global Gateways, the Kelley Marketing Team, Zach Watt and Brian Boucher from the Kelley Learning Media Team. And finally, I would like to thank Tim Smith from IIB, without whom this project would not have happened. You will meet Tim at the end of the program as he moderates any questions that you might have during the event. Just a note, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions and feel free to do so throughout the event. The last year has been unprecedented in our lifetime. The COVID-19 virus has forced all of us to redefine how we work, how we communicate, and even how we buy groceries. Individually, our worlds have gotten so much smaller. And with that, our purchasing behaviors have changed so dramatically. From hoarding essential items to not participating in the local economies, our relationships with the broader economy has changed regardless of where you are in the world. Unemployment is high, supply chains are challenged, transportation and logistics have had to redefine the way they deliver products and services. We have asked our panel to explore what this means. How do we kickstart our local, regional, and world economies to return to some level of normal? And in parallel to regenerating what we had, we need to ask, what did we learn so we're prepared for the next time? Or maybe even more importantly, what are the good ideas that emerged from this massive macro disruption that need to continue? Not a small topic, but that said, our moderator and panel for the day are more than up to the task. It is my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Steve Lutz. Steve is Vice President of the Middle East Affairs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and is responsible for managing the U.S.-Egypt Business Council, the U.S.-Iraq Business Initiative, and the U.S. GCC Business Initiative, and serves as Executive Director for each. In this capacity, Steve is responsible for developing and implementing policies and programs that promote U.S. business opportunities and investment in Egypt, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and Bahrain. He works closely with chamber member companies and business and government leaders to deepen and expand commercial relationships. Steve joined the chamber from the U.S. Department of Commerce's International Trade Administration, where he was a senior legislative affairs specialist in the Office of Legislative and Intergovernment Affairs. He focused on educating members of Congress on the benefits of trade and foreign direct investment and advancing the administration's trade agenda on Capitol Hill. Steve also served as congressional liaison to the President's Export Council and Manufacturing Council for the department. He earned his bachelor's degree in marketing from Indiana University's Kelley School, and he serves on the board of directors at the American University in Iraq Soleimani Foundation. Steve, welcome, and thank you for moderating today's distinguished panel.
Well, Levon, thank you so much. And I really want to thank you and Tim both, for the invitation and for this, and to the host of this Kelley School of Business and to the Institute for International Business for putting on such an important discussion globally. So we are honored to be here today. And before I turn to the panel, I thought I would just offer a few reflections to hopefully help set the stage. At the U.S. Chamber, we represent the interest of about 3 million American companies of all sizes and sectors. And what we're most known for domestically is our engagement with Congress and the administration and the alphabet soup of regulatory agencies to engage on issues which impact business. Our international division, though, is in fact the biggest part of the U.S. Chamber, and in many respects reflects the interest and growing opportunities for American companies. And in the international division, we do that same core business efforts where we turn our efforts to improve the business environment and engage governments around the globe. And many of you may be surprised to know that the Middle East Department is in fact the largest department in our international division. As we look across the Middle East, we know that American energy and finance, and manufacturing, and defense companies have a long track record and have built and sustained partnerships for several decades in the region. As we look to the future, we want to continue to strengthen those partnerships while also creating similar ties and collaborations across the range of knowledge-based sectors where there continues to be a lot of focus, like health and digital, as countries look to invest and really diversify their economies and create jobs in these areas. Most of the governments in representing the major markets in the region, like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, all have vision plans, to transform their economies, to be competitive in growth industries of the future. And major investments have been made into assorted mega projects with aggressive timelines. And we know that governments are pursuing regulatory and policy reform agendas and have efforts to empower the private sector, all to compete for investment. And then, of course, the pandemic hit. The human toll, of course, has been unimaginable. And the economy, there's been a dramatic slowdown, of course, and the consequences and job loss and the business shutdowns have been really acute, of course. And in the Middle East, there's been the dual challenges of COVID-19 and the initial collapse of the oil prices, which have, of course, had a major impact, compelling many governments in the region to borrow and pursue record debt programs and curb what were generous public salaries and pensions. And let's not forget that there's been several other existing trends that predated the pandemic as well playing out across the region, which will certainly have implications in a post-COVID recovery. They include, but aren't limited to, the rising concerns over climate change and an energy transition, a push for more inclusive economies and opportunities for women, a youth bulge in many unsustainable public payrolls, and a myriad of geopolitical challenges ranging from diplomatic hostilities and political rifts to terrorism in some failed states. The pandemic has also driven, I think it's important to note, positive developments, a focus on the need to invest in public health, and accelerated adoption of digital technologies across societies and economies, an emphasis on sustainability and the importance of resiliency in supply chains. All present significant opportunities across the Middle East. So that's my imprecise effort to set the stage. And I'll be ending by just adding, I'm a pragmatist, but at heart an optimist. So on a positive note, I do believe that the future of the Middle East really is a story that's going to be written by its youth. I've had the good fortune to meet a lot of young people across the region over many years. They're obviously incredibly bright, they're eager, they're driven. And while there may be degrees of frustration amongst the youth in the region, I do believe that for the vast majority, the sense of hope far exceeds any notion of defeat. So it's incumbent on business, government leaders, other stakeholders like universities to harness the potential of the youth across the region and work to ensure qualities of opportunity as we look to come through this pandemic. So I'm delighted to be joined by what is really an all-star panel, and I'm going to introduce them individually, and then we'll just jump right into it. First up, we're delighted to be joined by Her Excellency, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, a Minister of International Cooperation in the Arab Republic of Egypt. Dr. Mashat is the minister and started there in December of 2019. Prior to that appointment, she was the first woman to serve as Egypt's Minister of Tourism between January 2018 and December 2019. Previous positions included advisor to the chief economist at the IMF, sub-governor for monetary policy at the Central Bank of Egypt, and senior economist at the IMF. For those who don't know, the Ministry of International Cooperation oversees active partnerships across a portfolio exceeding $25 billion and is mandated to strengthen Egypt's inclusive multilateral, regional, and bilateral engagement with development partners, governments, global policymakers, the United Nations, the private sector, and civil society, all to deliver the national economic agenda, which is consistent with UN SDGs aimed at achieving a circular economy. At the Ministry of Tourism, it's important to note that Dr. Al-Mashat launched Egypt's tourism reform program, a structural reform designed to create a comprehensive, coherent, and consistent policy aimed at unleashing Egypt's potential in the tourism sector, which represents 15% of the country's GDP. And with implementation of that program, tourism revenues exceeded their highest levels in Egypt's history, accelerating by 66%. Dr. Al-Mashat has received numerous international and domestic awards and recognition. To cite a few, she was the 2019 Global Champion Award from the World Tourism and Travel Council. She was selected among the top 50 most influential women in the Egyptian economy in 2015. In 2014, the Young Global Leaders Award by the World Economic Forum. And in 2013, she earned the Distinguished Alumni Award from the School of Business at the American University in Cairo. Dr. Al-Mashat, thank you for being with us today. Introducing our next panelist, I'd like to turn to Janamitra Devan, the Chief Strategy Officer at the NEOM Company. Dev is leading the effort to chart the course of strategic implementation of NEOM, a $500 billion effort to create a city that has environmental preservation at its heart and is an experiment for futuristic urban living. Prior to taking this exciting role and coming to Northwest Frontier in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, he was an advisor to an array of corporate chieftains and boards and several public and private institutions. He was a former vice president of the World Bank Group overseeing financial and private sector network, where he was also a member of the Financial Stability Board in Switzerland. He also oversaw the Ease of Doing Business report and several practices of the World Bank, covering a wide array of advisory services from financial services and inclusion to competitiveness and innovation. Prior to his time at the World Bank, Dev served as the director of the McKinsey Global Institute in Shanghai, China, and before that as the director of practice at McKinsey's Global Strategy Practice here locally in Washington, D.C. He was born in Singapore, and Dev obtained his PhD in business economics and public policy and international business from Indiana University in Bloomington. And rounding out our panel, we're joined by Annie Chu. Annie currently serves as the executive director of aftermarket sales and independent channel of Cummins Africa and Middle East. In that business organization, since 1919, Cummins has turned challenges into opportunities, always looking for new solutions to power a more prosperous world. With more than 60,000 employees across the globe, Cummins is a company founded on unwavering values and a willingness to solve problems for their customers, communities, and the environment to make the world a better place. Annie joined Cummins in 2010 and has served in various roles across different functions, including strategy, business development, sales, and general management. She's traveled to over 30 countries, serving in a variety of various Cummins global assignments. Annie attended Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, earning a bachelor and a master's degree in economics, And then following her graduation, she joined EY as a staff accountant. In 2018, she joined the full-time MBA program at the Kelley School of Business in Indiana University and graduated in 2010. And she is currently based in Dubai, there in the United Arab Emirates. So thank you to our panelists and thank you to all the viewers for being with us today. To get us started, I'd love to just look at a broad ranging question, and I'll go in the order of those how we introduced you, starting with Her Excellency Dr. Rania. First question being, the global pandemic has changed the world economy. What are some of the macroeconomic implications that you're witnessing, and how do you believe these changes will impact recovery efforts in Egypt and across the region? And do you think these changes will be permanent?
Thank you, Steve, for the introduction and for inviting me to this panel, and my greetings to everyone who's joining. Let me talk in a global context first. Of course, what started as a health pandemic and a health crisis ended up being with unprecedented socioeconomic implications for each and every country in different ways. Of course, different governments intervened by creating fiscal stimuli packages, some directed towards the private sector, small businesses, others towards citizens. Other types of fiscal help was to basically waive the payments that companies have to make in the very vulnerable sectors such as aviation and hospitality. So one key outcome, macroeconomic outcome of all of this is the increase in debt. The increase in debt on the sovereign side, the increase in debt for the business side, and the increase of debt for individuals, just because the contraction in the economy was quite big. This is in a global setting. So we have these different conversations with rating agencies and so forth. The metric for debt sustainability has not been updated, right, or has not been accommodating to the size of the health pandemic and its implications. So countries are still and sovereigns are still being judged or benchmarked against metric which are there before 2020. So this is just sort of a global observation. Different countries have different levels or the degrees by which the fiscal stimulus was there, the degree by which its external debt increased. These are different by different countries, but that's an overall theme that you would find the IMF writing about, the World Bank writing about, the OECD writing about. If I go in the Egyptian context, one very important feature for our economy is that we were the only country in the Middle East with a positive growth rate in 2020. And that comes on the back of very important macroeconomic reforms that took place before 2020. So between 2016 and 2019, we had a very bold homegrown program with the IMF, where fiscal consolidation was the name of the game. Capital inflows came again, so foreign exchange buffers were quite sizable. So that protected the macro picture as we went through the crisis in 2020. Something else very important, this was coupled with investments in projects related to electricity, transportation, energy, etc. And these new cities and all of these projects continued through 2020. And so there was this mitigation effect from the fallout of the crisis. So a few lessons learned, if you will, in our case, never be complacent. Reforms are a continuous process. We reformed in the relatively good times. So when the bad time hit, we did not have to do what is labeled the cold shower, have a cold shower, the cold shower effect, but actually we had enough buffers to sail us through. Something else which was quite important is transparently communicating your policy frameworks. And that's why in June 2020, we went through a standby agreement with the IMF. The financing was not that big, but what was key was that our macroeconomic policies are transparently published by an independent institution, one of the biggest financial institutions globally. And this provides credibility to what the government plans to do going forward. So those are just a few takeaways when it comes to the global implication and how countries, going forward have to think about, this debt issue and it's debt across. It's not just countries, but it's private sector and citizens. And then reform is a continuous process, and always have transparent policy frameworks for markets and investors and everyone to be able to follow you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Almashad. And it was very interesting to hear, your analysis on the macro, but I was going to ask you about the secret sauce there in Egypt and how you had positive GDP growth, as you mentioned, the only country to do so in the region last year. So thank you for illuminating on that. We really appreciate that. Dev, let me come over to you with that, with the same question. Your thoughts on some macroeconomic implications that you're witnessing, and any thoughts on there in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the region more broadly?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel discussion. The impact of the pandemic has certainly been, a significant one, and I almost, would say it's sort of put us on a war footing. World goods trade, right, roughly has declined by around 9.5%, right, in 2020. Global FDI inflows, right, plunged by a whopping 42% to about $860 billion, if I remember correctly. And across the world, all regions and economic groupings, whether it's the ASEAN in Southeast Asia or all the way to the Mercosur in Latin America, they all witnessed negative FDI growth. So the recovery efforts in the regions will necessarily be different. And I believe Dr. Rania, put it very well with regards to, the implications, right, for how countries come out of the macroeconomic predicament. And I think the policy tools will vary, right, from fiscal tools to monetary ones. Now, closer to home, I believe, and I'm talking about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, right? And I'm no expert in the kingdom's internal affairs, but at least I can offer some observations, right? The pandemic hit the KSA in several different ways, I think. One, it hit the mainstream economy through business shutdowns and lockdowns and other downs, right? In so many different ways. And if you remember, the KSA, due to its fiscal rebalancing efforts, also introduced its value-added tax, right? 5% in 2018, if I didn't get the dates wrong, and found that they had to increase it again, right, to a whopping 15% during the pandemic, given the squeeze on its budget deficit. That is on one side. And then remember that, while the kingdom is not known yet, right, as a major conventional, tourist destination, but the kingdom is, relied on 3 to 4 million visitors per year during the Hajj, right, which this year I believe falls in July, and further, it typically hosts something like 4.5 million visitors for Umrah, right? And that is the visits that Muslims from around the world, right, pay to Mecca. This was a massive impact, right? It was a massive impact while it could be viewed as a microeconomic disturbance of sorts, it was a major impact for them to deal with. Now, there could be a mini boom in the near future, right? One could say, there's pent-up demand, and you could apply that to the international scale as well, right? Where there might be pent-up demand for suppressed travel, right? That would come forth once the pandemic has been contained in some way. But there's considerable uncertainty, right? And that uncertainty comes from the fact that we still don't have visibility with regards to how individual countries, right, come out of the pandemic. And in the case of the KSA, if you look at Muslim majority economies like Indonesia, India, well, India not a majority, but a significant Muslim population, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and several other countries, the recovery of the Hajj tourism factor, if you could call it, or Umrah, right, is highly dependent, right, on when those recoveries take place. And on the kingdom's part, right, it's got to figure out whether you just open the doors, right, or take a more strategic view, right, with regards to how you open up. So now I'm laying a number of factors that come on, while the kingdom has also tried to make adjustments, right, away, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit more later, right, with leaving a fossil fuel economy behind and recraft itself, to go to fossil-free, right, based economies. So I think there are significant challenges. I think, like you, Steve, I see the cup as half full, right, rather than half empty down here. I do believe that the policies that the government has put in place over the past several years, right, has created a degree of resiliency, especially amongst its younger population. And I'm surrounded here in NEOM, right, by young Saudis who are absolutely inspiring, right, in terms of the way they are thinking about the potential for growth in their country. Let me stop right there.
No, thank you. A lot of interesting points you brought forward. I'd mention one thing, just picking up on one of the last things you mentioned. Very interestingly, last week we had a 2-day U.S.-Saudi Business Leaders Forum, and by far the topic of conversation on many panels was on energy transition, sustainability, climate change. And this is keep in mind, this is a U.S.-Saudi business leaders discussion with a variety of government officials. And it was very much focused on that topic. So I think you hit one of the nails on the head there. So very, very interesting point.
Absolutely.
Annie, let me, if I may, come to you with the same question. Obviously, Cummins, multinational, major company working in markets not only across the Middle East but around the globe. So from that private sector Cummins perspective, how are you seeing this macro, and then how do you see it playing out in the Middle East?
Thank you, Steve, for the question and for the introduction. And again, thanks for inviting to join. I think Dr. Rania and Dave are definitely more experts on the microeconomic side, and I completely agree what they said. In general, the impact across the board, and it's unprecedented. However, each country, how they deal with that and the situation they're in might be different, right? So for a global company, we play in like Cummins now in the Africa, Middle East region. We have these 68 countries covered with some embargoed country. It's a vast territory. So we witness that kind of variety, especially the big spectrum. And talk about the MENA, what we probably zoom in a little bit. I think the major impact, I just pick one thing, is specifically about the oil price. as we all know, this is a region, 1/3 of the, the oil come from, and then 1/4 or 1/4 of the, natural gas come from this region. This region, most of the economies are heavily reliant on this, fossil oil or, hydrocarbon. Then I think even before the pandemic started, right, we already see the pricing drop. And then we already see that's why most of countries started their journey of diversification, right? They don't have a choice. They see that's coming. And if what I can say, one thing is this pandemic just hit in a way, kind of make it critical and probably even make it more urgent for the majority to consider diversify, away from that as soon as possible and prepare a future. That's why I think Dave mentioned about like Saudi already have all these programs, right? Saudization, which is ICTVA, and here, the UAE also. And so in a way, they're already on the path. It's really being impacted by this to speed up. The question is how well they can do, right? Each country, the governance, the different kind of physical condition will be different to drive that. And I would say, just like every crisis, you will see someone emerge even stronger than before. And some probably fail quite badly and struggle for some time, right? That's what we're witnessing. And the big impact for this, kind of diversification effort, you need to see there's a little bit of dilemma here. On one hand, because most of projects here are funded by the government or by the public investment fund in a way. So they begin to have much smaller pool compared to before because of the competing priorities, including providing the healthcare, providing, all the specific measures to make the economy still vive and to stay, kind of survive this crisis. However, so from that perspective, we see lots of projects have been put on hold, right? So that impacted our lots of, revenues and sales. But on the other hand, you will see, and then in order to come out of the crisis, lots of government also inject more funds to prepare to invest more because they need that to get the economy back. And then we will see. It's just about probably some depending on the investment. So probably like UAE, for example, before we really heavily see it's on the tourism and the resorts and etc. And then the real estate. Now you probably can see more towards, I think Dubai even announced this Vision 2040. It's about making Dubai the best living city in the world. What they try to do is to attract the talent and also to take advantage about the technology push us to accept remote working. They want to attract all these people who are allowed to work remotely from no matter where you are based to Dubai, and so that to revive the economy. So you can see the investment will leaning towards more new technology and to attract the high-tech kind of talents. So that's where experience. So as a company, we definitely need to closely monitor. And then also, we also want to survive in a way, don't miss any opportunities. So for example, the data center, right? That's an area we see a booming, actually, because more people stay home using internet. So they have booming on the data center. We saw that's a huge kind of increase, and we sell the gensets to them. And then on the other hand, for the big construction equipment, etc., we probably see some dip, right? And then, so these are the things we're trying to balance through. And again, try to leverage each country's different situation and also leverage the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. That's very interesting. And I'm sure companies like Cummins, that are doing business broadly across the region are kind of doing the same thing, trying to anticipate where the opportunities will be and perhaps where there'll be a pivot away from. And I think you hit another nail on the head, which was some of the trends that were already existing even before the pandemic. And that certainly being, the drop in the oil prices. Obviously, they've, picked back up a little bit. But we know that, there's this global discussion going on, about energy transition. Won't happen overnight, but it's certainly already ongoing. Dr. Rania, would love to come back to you, sticking kind of on this theme and looking at things both macro and at the quote unquote local level. we do see some of the world's financial markets starting to return or getting close to pre-pandemic numbers. Of course, not all have done so. What facets or factors of the pandemic do you think are contributing to the ongoing market volatility, and what kind of impact do you see them having on recovery efforts going forward, whether it be the macro or that micro level?
I mean, I think overall it's a country by country specific story. So for instance, in our case, given the way things were handled before the pandemic and during the pandemic, our access to the international markets have been quite exemplary. And we were also the first country in the Middle East to issue a green bond during 2020, and it was very much oversubscribed. So it really, I think markets are being, I don't want to say selective, but trying to distinguish, and that's the nature of it. Of course, at the beginning of the pandemic, markets were a bit wary because of what happened to the oil prices, and of course the fundamentals of many companies were being affected by the contraction. The projections were not very positive, and then governments came in, as I mentioned, with fiscal stimuli, which again pushed markets up, and there's a lot of liquidity in the system. And if you take a look at the US today, fears of inflation and so forth are returning back in the discussion. So some of the important points is, and I take the case of Egypt, we continued to be very measured when it comes to our fiscal response. So the economy moved well, but at the same time, we did not lose credibility with international markets because certain ratios which make sense and are important were protected and actually safeguarded, and we're actually pushing forward with more reforms. So that was extremely important, and that's a message that we are always saying. The pandemic is not there forever. It's the economy which is going to continue, and we want to make sure that we are not derailed from the reform agenda. We are not derailed from our eyes on the SDG development agenda. We are very open to multilateralism, and through the Ministry of International Cooperation, we have been able to secure close to $10 billion in development finance to different types of projects with multilateral and bilateral partners. And we published this in our report for anyone who wants to see the width of our partnerships across sectors. It's again a testament that the world multilateralism works, and the world is voting with its feet when it comes to opportunities in Egypt for the future. So it's been a I mean, again, as policymakers, it's very important not to panic, to try and internalize the upside and the downside risks. The trade-off was extremely tight, but I think the cushions that we had in the economy and the amount of effort that was put into very important projects that affected people's livelihood, but also pushed the potential of the economy, whether it's moving from an electricity sector which is in deficit into one that now is in surplus and can export. If you're going to the gas sector, similarly, if you're taking a look at water, wastewater management and other types of projects. So all of these are extremely important when it comes to creating potential to push further economic growth, create employment and so forth. So I think that my story on the markets is we have to be very mindful of what they look at, and we are continuing to reform, not being complacent despite the difficulties.
Dr. Rania, thank you so much. I mean, I think that those are very wise words, and to Egypt's credit, I think you have been very targeted and look to do things that are impactful. So kudos for that, and I think that speaks volumes. Dev, coming to you, same question. Obviously, there's some bit of recovery that we're witnessing, but obviously there's still volatility, and would welcome your thoughts either at the macro or at the country level, or even the NEOM level. What factors you see still creating volatility, and how you see that continuing to go forward?
Thank you. I'm going to actually focus my remarks in this particular case with the global dimension, right? And there are a couple of things that, although I said that I'd like to, see the glass half full, there's a couple of things that worries me, right? And if you look at the trends, for example, in trade that took place before the pandemic, right? There were already signs, as we all knew, right, that there were various pressures on protectionism as a whole, right, rearing its ugly head. And we saw that in a general decline in the traditional North trade and the North-South trade, right, in favor of South-South trade, right? So South-South trade, in other words, developing countries to developing countries, that part of trade has had actually robust growth, right? But in general, the trade picture was already cloudy, right, before the pandemic. And then the pandemic hit, and of course, trade took a even bigger downfall. Now, during the pandemic, and now you see during the administration of the vaccines, we've also seen a tremendous amount of vaccine nationalism, right, take place. Now, those things are, to me, very worrying, right? It's worrying in the sense that they are precursors to something bigger, right? And the debate, the anti-globalization debates and so on had taken place in very nefarious ways, I thought, even before the pandemic and continuing to today. So where do we see the silver lining, right, in all of this? And there is a silver lining, because if you look deeper, right, as to what structures, new structures are emerging, we see with glaring perception, I would say, right, that the fundamentals of the types of products, right, that are crossing borders has changed significantly, right? Despite the movement of anti-globalization and so on. That invisible portion, right, of trade deals with data, right? The trade in data has become massive, right? We're talking about, data transfers, right, that are currently taking place at a Library of Congress per second, all right? The Library of Congress is the repository of, or a benchmark of the repository of the total knowledge, right, that is in the world. And that part is growing enormously, right? So the silver lining, right, is that we are going very rapidly from a world of tangible trade, right, to a world of intangible trade. The intangibles portion, right, of value creation, right, that is taking place now in the world is in fact growing by leaps and bounds, right? So the challenge here now, right, I think for local economies that can adapt to the challenge, and I know that the kingdom is making a play for that, right, through its focus on data side, technology driven industries, offers opportunities, right, and offers opportunities, I think, to a vast array of countries coming in to the picture. So it's an element that we need to pay attention to, that it's not all a gloomy story. There are streaks down here that we could take advantage of. In terms of the market volatility that is going down, I can see one good thing that could happen if um, if two countries, right, can actually lead us out of it, and I put this at China and the US, right? These are still the two giants, right? China has done fairly well even during the pandemic, given, I mean, they've had challenges, obviously, but from a macroeconomic perspective, the performance is there. And the US has fundamentally kept its competitiveness, right? And despite being derailed, right, by the pandemic, I think it's a country to watch over the next 6 to 12 months. And I say this because we know that what happens in the US and China cannot be ignored, right? Because it represents a pull factor, right, to the rest of the world. I do, again, go back and worry, right, that the trend of protectionism is also in the US, right? We saw that in the Trump administration. There's still no clear evidence that the Biden administration is going to move in a different direction. So that is still a worrying point. But having said that, I think the sheer weight of these two economies, and hopefully, you know, India joins the foray as well, could potentially be, you know, another silver streak that, you know, we can look out for.
And very interesting points. And I think what you were talking about there with the intangible trade and the movement of data is fascinating, because I know at the Chamber, one thing we talk to governments around the Middle East and really around the globe, you talked about nationalism and protectionism, oftentimes is data localization. So kind of in that same spirit of trying to fence in something like the cloud, which defeats the whole purpose. But you're absolutely right. So I think having those discussions, I think, will have been accelerated going forward. And that's a very, very interesting point beyond the trade in goods and in product. Very interesting. Annie, I'd love to turn to you, and any thoughts, any perspective you might have either on factors in market volatility, or if you want to pick up on any of Dev's point, you know, given the roles that Cummins kind of plays across the globe in trade.
Thank you, Steve. I think Dave really kind of said it well. That's a worry we have, especially as a global company, right? We see so more like a protectionism. It's not, it's kind of going backwards, how we can handle and deal with, right? But I also see, if there's good things coming out of this, or where's the silver lining, back to Dave's point, I would see, especially for this region, first thing is, as we mentioned about, there will be countries fare pretty well, can come out soon, like Egypt, like KSA, like UAE. There will be countries fare pretty poorly. Hopefully, the good ones can show a good example to others, because they have the common kind of traits in there. And for example, become more open up, tolerant, and inclusive, and be more tuned to the new technology, and also very good governance. So these are the key kind of traits, make them probably doing much better than other. I hope this can provide a good guidance, and then to kind of direct the region moving to the right, way. That's one. And the second one is, again, back to this new technology adoption rate. It's this pandemic really forced us, and especially this region, in a much faster speed than we expected, right? Like we said now here, using apps to track and to kind of immediately issue you the certificate about vaccination. These things all happened in a very fast speed, much better, much faster than we expected. And this is a good thing. The new technology adoption rate will bring the efficiency, and also probably can help a generation kind of transformation. So that's where we see a more silver lining.
Well, thank you for that, Annie. And I do want to stick with this idea of the silver lining, and Dr. Runyon, perhaps come back to you. Again, we know, as I mentioned early on, the human toll's been tragic, it's been immense, but there certainly have been innovations, there have been positive developments. Would love to hear your perspective on what you see as part of the next normal, and from your vantage point, what are some of the key developments that the Middle East and Egypt can seize upon to help us with the recovery and to ultimately kind of sustain economic growth?
You know, the new normal to me is dynamic. You know, there's no longer an equilibrium called the new normal, because things keep on coming up, and we have just, the new normal is that we have learned to adapt quickly to whatever the world is going to throw at us, right? Being more patient, being more collaborative, or just, you know, dealing with it. I think that's the only new normal that exists. But, you know, how international trade would look, how this, how that, I think things are, you know, today you're talking about not a trade war in a traditional manner, but you have you know, ICT and digital, and, you know, it's another concept. You have space as another place where people are competing. So this concept of new normal is just, you know, it's evolving, it's dynamic. But I think some of the you know, important silver linings, if you will, is that the social effects of you know, have to be taken into account. Sustainability is no longer a pretty word in a report. It has a meaning. Climate change, now people sympathize more than they used to in the past, because you know, it's now affecting health, and when it affects health, all of us know what happens. It's no longer a local problem in a country, it's a global problem, and therefore all of us have to think about it collectively. So I think these are important points. Countries, when they are designing their programs, more focus is put on health. Maybe it wasn't as prominent as before. Social safety nets, inclusivity of gender, and how do we harness the fourth industrial revolution? How do we make sure that we keep on pushing digital infrastructure? Who would have imagined a bureaucracy of around 4 million employees overnight have to work from home and function? If it was and I'll keep on saying this, if it was a fire drill, you know from your firm the date of the fire drill, which stairs you're going to take, etc. And it's done department by department. This was the biggest unexpected fire drill, and we had to function. So I mean, it's I think that reprioritizing in a way which is which has more commonalities rather than differences between countries. I think that is what I'm seeing or sensing, and there is more agreement among the collective masses, if you will, about some of the issues related to the green recovery, inclusivity, you know, more transparency, better governance. So these are words now that resonate more than just being you know, topics that decorate some of the policy dialogues or reports.
You know, Dr. Rania, that's very interesting. And I love the fire drill analogy, because I think you're absolutely right. We all know, you know, which stairwell to go down and all of those things. So that's very interesting. I do think you're right. I think you see governments making the reforms actually carrying forward, and it's not just buzzwords anymore, but they're actually moving on things. So very interesting points. Dev, would you like, I'd love to have you pick up on any of those trends that you see playing out, be it in Saudi Arabia or in the region, and what do you think is important, you know, as we kind of move into this next phase of recovery and ideally what kind of long-term economic growth? Dev, I believe you're muted. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'd like to come closer to looking at some possible innovations, right, that are coming out of the pandemic. I think it's right that, you know, from the social setting perspective, I mean, take the US, for example, right? The US has shown that the pandemic has exposed socially excluded minorities, right? And that there's an entire arena there that requires intervention of sorts. And that has raised the bar, I believe, even in the US, right? That Americans are now, you know, putting pressure on their political leaders with higher expectations for diversity and inclusion beyond what the US has already achieved, you know, through the civil rights movements and so on. So the pandemic has kind of exposed that, right? And I love it. I love that that's happening. And I can see that happening in some other economies in Europe as well. But COVID-19 has also accelerated innovation and changes in cities, right? Now, remember, 2/3 of global population is expected to be in cities. So it's an important dynamic of what happens there. And I think a significant amount of wealth creation is going to take place out of, city units. Why has COVID-19 accelerated this? It's accelerated an adoption of, for example, online collaboration tools, right? We've seen a flourish of that come out in the recent 6 months, even, right? It's forced legacy companies who've been putting off, right, technological rebuilding or innovations, and these companies have completed multi-year digital transformation projects in a matter of months, right? So, and that has been spurred on by the pandemic as well. Workplace arrangements have also spurred change. Now, telemarketing, education, fitness, right? I mean, if you look at these examples, right, it's created this new phenomenon of the home economy, right? There's an array of product groups that are coming in there. Also, a lot of talk, right, about strengthening technology infrastructure, right? Wi-Fi and broadband, right? Especially as it relates to the rural enclaves, right, in several areas. So there's a significant amount of activity that can be seen on the positive side. Now, who knows what happens to other aspects like real estate, right? I mean, you've got entire companies now. Capital One comes to mind because my daughter works down there, and you see Capital One all of a sudden saying, hey, it's okay, for you guys to work remotely, 3 days a week. In fact, we'd love for you to do that, right? It's fantastic because it's shown to work, right? It actually works, right? And now what the implications of that will be on commercial real estate values down the road when the contract periods end, I don't know, right? That remains to be seen. Now, is that same phenomenon happening everywhere else, right? We look at it in the US, we look at it in some of the advanced industrial countries. I don't know, what the state of play is in China with regards to work arrangements and so on from home, or in India. But coming closer to home here, right, in the KSA, or even in the GCC, and I'd love to hear my fellow panelists' view on this. Would we see the same trends, right, take place, right, with regards to more remote working habits, right? We know that currently, right, a number of companies in the KSA have resorted to that. Will that be sustained throughout and change the fundamental dynamics? I don't know, right? There are other facets here that that we still don't know whether it would follow the same trends, right, as we are seeing elsewhere. But in terms of how it's opened doors to innovation, right, in this so-called at-home economy, right, that is taking place, is phenomenal to see. We are witnessing it, right, as we speak.
Dev, that's absolutely fascinating. And I thought one of your initial points on cities was very interesting. And knowing that you're there at NEOM and looking to, build this futuristic city, it's very interesting how this almost plays into the strength of a future like NEOM, or, the new capital there in Egypt, or as you mentioned, like the Dubais of the world. Very, very interesting. I think on the home economy, I think you're absolutely right. And it just makes me think, I wish I had bought stock in Peloton when it IPO'd. I feel like I missed the boat on that one. But no, a lot of innovation going on and a lot of investment that's being accelerated and compelled forward. Very, very good points. Annie, coming to you, would love to hear your thoughts. I mean, perhaps if you could maybe speak to what this has meant to Cummins with your global supply chain. I'd be very curious on, what the outlook is. A lot of points have been raised on trade, but also, bringing things closer to home. So would love to hear what that means for you at Cummins.
Supply chain is really, I think, an area or the domain which significantly be impacted by this pandemic or tested, I think. So again, just using us as an example, Cummins last year, Q1, Q2, we witnessed the historical sales drop and in the Cummins history for a long time. And then in Q2 to Q3, we experienced the historical upswing, like the increase in the history as well. Imagine this kind of demand swing, what kind of strain it's going to cause or, impacted our supply chain. It's huge. And so we are just lucky enough is actually we started the supply chain transformation right before the pandemic. And we already realized that that's the area we really need to do things different. I think that the major change of strategies before we focus on is try to winning at the handoffs. With a new strategy, what we try to do is, why don't we reduce the handoffs, right? That's a fundamentally prevent the failure. And then in a way, we're fully centralized and have a global supply chain team to oversee, including manufacturing, including our parts, all this distribution center across world. So that really helped tremendously during this pandemic time, because you can imagine we have factories just like here. If I sell engine here, it possibly can come from South Africa, South America, and possibly North America or some UK. We have factories all across the world. And when the pandemic hit us, you will see it's different in different continents. And there may be Europe is really in a terrible shape. All the factories have been shut down, because of the pandemic. Then we need to quickly mobilize. China still up running. So we can quickly mobilize and then got all the supplies from China, and including the supply point and also including the supply, the route, right? Before we are really like, just try to say this recent incident about Suez Canal, right? We have containers, 14 containers got stuck there. If before we will run out of the parts and be in that 10 or 14 days of shortage, now we can quickly, this central supply chain can look after where are the critical urgent needs, and then where other corner of the world have that quickly shipped either through the South Africa point or directly air freight. So these are the things really. I would say this pandemic, if they change one function significantly, that has to be supply chain. They have to look at differently. But also back to Dave's point, there was also additional challenge about this more protectionism, right? That's put a totally different game for us, like a global company. How we position our supply. For the efficiency point, we totally would appreciate a more supply, global base. However, with this domestic or more trade protection, we also need to play to see, okay, there's other factor you need to take into, right? Then we might need to domesticize or localize, right? These are the things, really posing a different challenge. I don't think that we're 100% there yet, but I think it's really a new challenge. But whoever can do a good job, I think we're gonna win. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. Very, very interesting on analysis on the supply chain and to hear kind of how it played out real time, for Cummins and how you adjusted, to the challenge of the pandemic and see it going forward. Shifting gears a bit, one thing coming to you, Dr. Rania, I wanted to, you touched on this, we've touched on this on the idea of inclusive recovery. And we know it intuitively and the data bears it out. We know that women have been disproportionately affected economically by the pandemic. And this includes the Middle East, where some countries obviously also have an overlay of some legacy challenges of bringing more women into the economy. So as the public and private sectors work together to come through and really hopefully supercharge this recovery, what steps do you think are important to taking to ensure that we do have that type of inclusive recovery and that disproportionate impact that we've seen from COVID doesn't become permanent?
So in our case, we were the first country to have a policy tracker on gender policies, and we were ranked the first country in West Asia and the Middle East with 21 policies which are gender sensitive for COVID. They included issues related to family situations and anti-violence and so forth. Something else, and as you mentioned, there is a realization now that, and today the World Economic Forum announced that COVID is pushing the gender agenda even wider because of the implications on jobs, digital, and so on. With the World Economic Forum in July and the National Council for Women in Egypt, we launched Closing the Gender Gap Accelerator. It's a private-public platform. So we have private sector co-chairs with us putting an agenda which is related to more parity when it comes to jobs, more women in leadership positions, and equal remuneration, including, of course, digital skills that can be rolled out. So we're not overlooking the gender agenda. We're trying to be mindful, despite some of the challenges that are faced, given schooling at home and all of the other issues that come along. But the rhetoric is there, and when the rhetoric is there, policies are designed to ensure that the fallout is minimized as much as possible. So we are committed to SDG 5. We have a national strategy that was launched in 2017. Currently, we are doing additional legislation that are going to also protect women against violence and harassment and so forth. So it is a life agenda. Egypt's story is one that is not fully told, and that's why we are also pushing, to under our global partnerships narrative to basically tell our story in a more streamlined and consistent fashion, where each and every project that we do, it comes under a narrative of people at the core. So who's benefiting the projects in action? Is it a sovereign project? Is it a private project? Or is it a partnership between both? And then purpose as the driver. Which SDG are we trying to meet by that partnership in any project that we're doing? So I think SDG 5 is definitely one that is as hype or as present as climate, and we're seeing it globally, it's something that we're pushing on a local level as well.
Well, thank you, Dr. Rania. I know your leadership is definitely appreciated on that, and you all are walking the walk. And I know a lot of American companies that are doing business there in Egypt, I know personally, are very focused on making sure women are in leadership roles, that they're part of their business operations and efforts. So a feather in your cap, and we continue to look forward to working with you on that. Dev, switching themes, I'd love to come to you specifically on NEOM. As we're the clock's starting to run out here, I did want to dig into a little bit. If, of course, NEOM is really one of the pillars of Vision 2030 and the kingdom's transformation to a knowledge-based economy. Would love to hear how NEOM has weathered, kind of through this pandemic. What have been your biggest challenges, and are you still on track with the project, and how do you see things going forward?
Thank you. I'd like, if you don't mind, to address just one aspect of the other question on women, because believe it or not, I happen to be very passionate about that topic, and I do want to say that I think the jury is out with regards to how women have been affected by COVID-19 here, right, in Saudi Arabia. I do not know the facts on that, but I'm sure if trends follow that, women have been affected here as well as in other places. But I do want to say this, right, especially to our Western audience. about this particular aspect. And I say it from the view of, that famous report, right, called Women, Business and the Law, that is put out by my former employer, the World Bank. Well, I had a thing or two to do with that, right, and introduced that some 11 years ago. And at that time, I can tell you, it was difficult facing up to the Saudi government and the ministers that I had to deal with, because I was rather unpopular, right, in pushing for that report. It's very interesting that here I am 11 years later, right, and the climate for women, right, has definitely changed, right, significantly for the better. I work with young Saudi women who unabashedly, right, come and tell me, Dev, you need to have been here 6 years ago, right, and the experience that we had to go through 6 years ago is starkly different from what it is now, right? And what they're saying, right, is that the gender movement or the openness, right, to women has vastly improved, right? In Saudi Arabia, I'm less conversant, right, in about the rest of the GCC. But it needs to be said, right, that the pace at which this change is taking place, it has overwhelmed me, right, a person who had followed this particular topic very closely. Let me go very quickly to NEOM. Has NEOM been affected, right, by COVID-19? Of course, right, like in every other instance. Now, fortunately, we were still at the stage, right, where there was a lot of thinking being done, right, with regards to how we do NEOM right, right? NEOM has got an aspiration of, spending upwards of 1.2 trillion riyals to build the land of the future as the land of the future where there will be no roads because there will be no cars, right? Land which will be 100% fueled, right, by renewables, mainly wind, right, and solar. A land that will have desalination plants, right, that would support the infrastructure. So it's an incredibly futuristic journey, and of course, it needed a lot of thinking with regards to how we do that. So we're very much on target, right, with regards to delivering a very high aspiration target of, finishing by 2030 with 1 million, resident population, 250,000 digital nomads, right, living in this area. And so the journey is definitely tight. We have decided that we cannot do it alone, right? That this is an invitation basically to the whole world, basically to join us, because the message that NEOM is trying to say is that NEOM is not just for Saudi Arabia, right? That we want to learn what the future of urban living, right, translates to, right? What a new form, right, of living, a new form of livability standards under the rubric of a new founding law, right, that would be distinct from the base economy, right, of the kingdom would look like. So it's a tremendous challenge, but we're currently, upwards of 800 or 900 staff. That will probably double by the end of the year. A good 50% of them are foreign, and the remaining 50% we've been able to attract some of the best and brightest Saudis and other members of the GCC community, right, to be part of this journey with us.
Well, it's fascinating, you know, even from my vantage point, to watch the progress being made and to see such a monumental project and as you said, futuristic project playing out. And we of course wish you well in that. And thank you for your passion. And of course, you're welcome to talk about the vitalness of economic inclusion. So we welcomed your comments on that as well. I know Dr. Rania had to leave us for another commitment, but I do, Annie, I want to come to you. Would love to hear your thoughts on what kind of the Cummings perspective and how you see in the Middle East, the role of women in business and, and really across the region, how that's playing out from your vantage point.
Yeah, I think for Cummins' perspective, Cummins really leading that upfront. I think you kind of treat like a gender equality is our top priority, and all the key, senior leaders, they have target and regarding, how many percentage is that. So they really track that. And for this region, when we came in, it was really challenging task because imagine, historically this culture here, right? There's just not so much we encourage, women to work. However, I do think the independence really comes from, they can earn their income. And then that will give them the power to really fight for a lot of other things. So I think this is very important to promote that. So we did a lot of things here and try to promote more females into our, I think, workforce. If I'm not mistaken, I think in the whole Africa Middle East region, our probably female employee representative is about 27 to 30%. And imagine we're a manufacturing and a very engineering kind of driven kind of company. This is quite significant. And then talking about this pandemic impact, you're right. I think it's kind of disproportionately felt. The impact was disproportionately felt, especially by women. So in that sense, we try a lot of things to try to help. For the female employees we currently have, we need to realize it's the impact to their life because now everyone work at home, right? And actually lots of female employees came to tell me, did you realize, because everyone work from home, even they work, their husband work, the expectation is they need to prepare all the lunch and, give the kids prepare for their schools. This all for on the woman's side, I think, in a way. So that we realize that, and then we try to be more accommodative. So that in a way is we really promote even this year, because now we really move into the remote working, and we promote is the kind of like my work arrangement. This is the objective on every manager's work plan. It's you make sure you talk with your direct employees and including your teams about what's the expectation about them. Is there any challenge they have? So that you set the right expectation and be more accommodating to their schedule, right? For example, some female employee can say, hey, I do need to watch my kids for these 2 hours. And then we will be more accommodated as a team in a way. We don't set up the team meeting during this time. Or lots of them will say, here Thursday is more like a Friday. Then they will have a specific commitment, family side, right? Then we will try to say, okay, Thursday, no meeting, no group meetings. And we try to squeeze the meetings in other 4 weekdays. These are the things we try to do, be more accommodative, so that we help the current workforce, female workforce, to be able to better adapt it to this remote work environment. And in another way is we talk about recruitment. We still have open roles, they will have turnover. When we recruit, we still very, very encourage to bring a female representation. It has to be started somewhere. There will be resistance. Lots of male employees will say, this is unfair. You kind of promote more, and how about us? So we're saying is, you need to realize the situation we're in, right? We have very, very few compared to the male, workforce. We have few. We need to change, start somewhere. I know it's hard very beginning, but if you don't look hard for the, capable female employees and then encourage them to join the program, you will never be able to change and to get to the where we want to head to. So that we kind of, in a way, to push whoever wants to hire, you at least for the people to interview, you need to have female representation. That way we push them to look harder for the capable female employees. At least give them the chance, the candidate, give them the chance to be interviewed. And even, then it's like the same equal standards, right? We are not like a lower standard. It's give the equal opportunity for them to have the chance to find a good job. And if they're not successful, at least we can give them feedback. Where are the gaps? So that in their life, in their career, they have at least idea to know, okay, this is something I need to work on in order for me to get there, right? So these are the things that we really try very hard. And in the company, even with the environment we're in, we will still try to drive that gender equality as much as we possible.
Annie, thank you so much. And I can't underscore enough how important, that equality of opportunity, that you really talked about is important, to having an inclusive recovery. And it's very interesting to hear how the intersection of kind of the work-life balance, the remote working, this issue, there's a lot of intersections there that obviously are going to continue to play out going forward. And it's really important for government leaders, business leaders, to find that right balance and to be considerate going forward, I think. So very, very great discussion around that. And it has been a great discussion. And I want to thank Dev, Annie, I want to thank you. I know Dr. Rania had to depart earlier, but we are grateful for her participation. And I want to turn to Tim Smith from our host, the Institute for International Business, to help bring us home. Tim?
Thanks, Steve, so much. And thank you to the panelists for your excellent thinking shared and for your ideas and for your inspiration today. It's been a wonderful discussion. And Steve, thank you so much for leading it. We very much appreciate you being a part of today's discussion. And thank you to the participants for joining us. We apologize, we've come to the end of our time, but this has been a wonderful discussion and we're excited to continue this series. Thank you all for participating. I wish you well.